The first ocean I ever saw was inside a burned book. Half the pages had fused together from heat damage, and the ink on the rest had bled into black smears where steam had soaked through the leather binding. I still kept it. Most people in the ash markets would have torn the gold thread from the spine and thrown the paper into a furnace. Paper burned hot and fast. Knowledge did not. Out in the cinder districts, survival usually won that argument. I turned the page carefully anyway. The picture showed an endless blue horizon beneath a pale sky. No lava. No smoke. No brass towers bleeding heat into the clouds. Just water stretching farther than the eye could see. I tried to imagine that much cold existing in one place. The thought made my scales itch. A distant furnace horn groaned somewhere beyond the canyon walls. Shift change. That meant the scavenger crews would start moving again soon. I snapped the book shut and slid it into my satchel before climbing deeper into the wreck. The caravan had died hard. Even now, 3 days after the ambush, the metal ribs of the transport still glowed dull orange beneath layers of cooling ash. One wheel had melted into the obsidian roadway. The smell of burned oil and cooked salamander still lingered in the air vents. I adjusted the cloth around my snout and kept working. Rule 14. If something valuable was abandoned, assume someone stronger planned to come back for it. That meant I had maybe another hour before the claim gangs arrived. The inside of the cargo hauler looked like a collapsed forge. Crates had burst apart during the attack, spilling chains, broken tools, and slagged machine parts across the floor. Heat shimmered from the ceiling vents. Somewhere deeper inside, steam hissed rhythmically. Not natural. I froze. One hand drifted slowly toward the screwdriver at my belt, not because it was a good weapon, because it was the only metal tool I owned that hadn't bent from the heat yet. Another hiss echoed through the corridor. Pressure release valve. Not breathing. I exhaled slowly. Good, I muttered to myself. Getting paranoid means I'm still alive. My reflection stared back at me from a warped brass panel nearby. Soot-covered scales, cracked goggles, oversized tool harness hanging off one shoulder. Small even for a kobold. Thin enough that most people assumed I was starving. Most days they were right. I crouched beside a shattered supply crate and began sorting through the contents mechanically. Copper wire. Bent beyond repair. Glass tubes. Keep rustless screws. Valuable. Charcoal filter mask. Very valuable. A small leather case sat wedged beneath a collapsed beam near the rear wall. No merchant markings. No heat damage, which meant someone had hidden it deliberately. I looked at the beam above it, then the floor, then the walls. No rune marks. No tension wire. No acid capsules. Still, I used the 10-foot rod strapped to my pack to pull the case closer. Careful, always careful. The fire plane punished careless people faster than devils did. The latch clicked open with a soft metallic snap. I immediately took 2 steps back. Nothing exploded. No poison gas. No cursed fired. I waited anyway. Rule 21. Traps came in layers. The case sat motionless in the ash while heat rippled around it. After a full minute passed without incident, I finally crouched beside it and carefully lifted the lid the rest of the way. Books. My pulse jumped. Not spellbooks. Those usually had locking runes, teeth, or both. These looked older. Trade journals maybe. Engineering notes. The leather covers were cracked from age, but unlike most salvage here, the pages had been sealed in waxcloth against moisture and heat. Someone had wanted these protected, which usually meant they were worth stealing. I slipped the first volume free and brushed soot from the cover. Flow regulation and pressure cycling in triple-chambered steam systems. I grinned before I could stop myself. Most people would have called it worthless. Most people were idiots. The sound echoed outside the wreck. Faint. Metallic boots. More than one pair. My grin vanished instantly. Claim gangs. Too early. I extinguished my lantern with a practiced twist and crouched low beside the collapsed crate pile. The darkness swallowed the compartment almost immediately, leaving only thin lines of orange glow leaking through cracks in the hull. Voices drifted through the metal shell. Check the rear compartments. Another voice answered. The ash rats probably already stripped it. Ash rats, that usually meant kobolds. I resisted the urge to hiss. Heavy footsteps climbed into the wreck above me. The metal frame groaned under their weight. Judging by the sound alone, salamanders. Too heavy for humans. Too organized for goblins. Wonderful. I slowly slid the books into my satchel, the bag already weighed enough to strain my shoulders. Another few pounds would hurt later. Worth it. A loud crash echoed somewhere deeper in the caravan, followed by rough laughter. Good. Distracted, I glanced upward, mentally tracing the wreck structure from memory. Cargo ramp behind me. Ventilation shaft to the left. Half-collapsed maintenance crawlspace overhead, too small for salamanders, perfect for me. Another set of footsteps approached, closer this time. I slipped the screwdriver from my belt and wedged it silently into a seam in the wall panel. The rusted grate shifted just enough for claws to fit through. Hot air blasted into my face as I pulled myself upward into the cramped shaft. The metal burned through my gloves immediately. I bit back a curse and kept climbing. Below me, the compartment door screeched open.
Someone's been here.
I froze. A long silence followed, then.
Fresh tracks.
My heartbeat thudded so hard I was sure they could hear it through the vents. One of them kicked something across the floor.
Probably just a scavenger runt.
Another voice laughed.
Then we searched the vents too.
I stopped breathing. The shaft suddenly felt much smaller. Hot air rolled through the vents in suffocating waves, carrying the stink of sulfur, burned oil, and salamander smoke. Sweat dripped beneath my scales and soaked into the cloth wrapping my neck. Below me, metal scraped against metal. They were opening maintenance panels. I crawled faster. The vent groaned under my weight as I pulled myself deeper into the wreckage. The space narrowed ahead into a junction clogged with old ash and warped duct plating. Barely enough room for my shoulders, perfect for a kobold, terrible for panicking. Behind me came the heavy clang of a vent cover being torn free. Well, one voice barked, another answered from below.
Small tracks. Real small.
A pause, then laughter.
Told you. Kobold.
Something long and metallic scraped through the shaft behind me. A spear. I flattened myself instinctively as the tip stabbed through the darkness where my legs had been moments earlier.
Come out, little rat.
The salamander hissed.
We will only break one arm if you cooperate.
I kept crawling. Another thrust slammed into the vent wall beside my head hard enough to dent the metal inward. Rust flakes showered across my goggles. The shaft ahead bent sharply downward. Good. I shoved myself forward and dropped through the opening feet first. For one horrible second I thought the floor was farther away. Then I crashed into a mound of old coal dust hard enough to knock the air from my lungs. Pain exploded through my shoulder. I rolled immediately. A spear punched through the vent above exactly where my chest had been.
Found her.
Of course they did. I scrambled upright and finally saw where I'd fallen. Boiler room. Huge cracked pressure tanks lined the walls beside ancient furnace pipes thick as tree trunks. Most were cold now, but several still hissed weakly with leftover steam pressure from the ruined engine core deeper in the caravan. An idea formed instantly. Dangerous ideas were usually my best ones. I sprinted toward the nearest valve wheel as the salamander forced itself halfway through the vent opening overhead. Brass armor scraped against the duct walls while its burning eyes locked onto me.
There you are.
I grabbed the wheel with both hands and threw my weight against it. Nothing happened.
Of course.
The salamander laughed and dropped from the vent with a crash that shook the room. I planted my feet against the pipe housing and pulled again with everything I had. The valve shrieked, then turned. The pipe exploded. A blast of superheated steam erupted sideways into the room with enough force to rip loose metal panels from the walls. The salamander barely had time to scream before the white cloud engulfed him completely. I dove behind a furnace housing as boiling vapor filled the chamber. The screams lasted 3 seconds, then stopped. Silence returned except for the roar of escaping steam. I stayed curled behind cover for several long moments, breathing hard. Then I heard more footsteps above, more of them. Wonderful. I looked at the flooding chamber, the ruptured pipes, and the overloaded pressure gauges rapidly climbing toward red, then slowly up toward the ceiling. The old emergency maintenance hatch still hung there, half rusted shut. 30 feet up. I tightened my grip on the screwdriver. Okay, I whispered to myself. New plan. The boiler gauges were still climbing. One needle twitched violently against the red line before snapping clean off. That was bad. I wiped steam condensation from my goggles and scanned the chamber again, forcing myself to slow down instead of panic. Panic made people stupid. Stupid people became charcoal. The maintenance hatch sat near the ceiling above a web of pipes and suspension chains. Old. Rusted. Probably unstable, still better than waiting for the salamanders. A loud bang echoed from the corridor outside.
They're in the lower compartments.
Another voice shouted back, muffled through metal.
Seal the exits.
Wonderful. Organized idiots. I crouched beside the ruptured steam pipe and quickly inspected the pressure housing. Ancient brass construction. Triple riveted. Industrial grade. One of the old caravan models built before the Afrit standardized disposable transport engines. Which meant whoever built this expected it to survive explosions. Probably. The pressure gauge beside me spun once and burst apart. Probably not for much longer. I slipped my satchel tighter across my shoulder and climbed onto the nearest pipe assembly. The metal burned through my gloves immediately. Pain later. Movement now. Steam roared around me as I pulled myself upward through the machinery. Chains rattled overhead. Somewhere below, furnace doors slammed open.
They went this way.
A spear struck sparks from the pipe beside my head. I climbed faster. The ceiling hatch looked worse up close. Layers of corrosion fused the hinges solid, and the wheel lock mechanism had partially melted at some point in the last century. I hooked one arm through a support chain and yanked my screwdriver free. Come on. Below me, 3 salamanders entered the chamber through the steam cloud, their outlines glowing orange through the haze. One pointed upward immediately.
There.
I jammed the screwdriver into the hatch seam and forced downward with all my weight. Nothing. A crossbow bolt hissed past my shoulder. I flinched instinctively and nearly slipped from the chain. Another bolt shattered against the metal beside my face.
Stop moving.
Someone shouted. I ignored them and drove the screwdriver deeper into the seam. The metal groaned, then stopped. One of the salamanders below raised a hooked spear toward the chain I was hanging from. Oh, that was clever. I kicked off the wall just as the spear slammed downward through the links. The chain snapped free with a violent crack. For one terrifying second I dropped, then my claws caught another hanging line. Pain shot through both arms hard enough to make my vision blurred. I dangled above the chamber while steam screamed around me. Below, the salamanders spread out, trying to corner me against the ceiling. One of them laughed.
No way out now, little rat.
I looked down at them, then slowly at the overheating boiler core beneath the room, then back at the hatch. The screwdriver was still wedged in the seam. An idea formed, a truly terrible idea, which meant it would probably work. I swung sideways on the chain and slammed both boots against the hatch wheel as hard as I could. The corroded mechanism cracked loose with a deafening screech. At the exact same moment, something deep inside the engine core detonated. The entire chamber lurched violently. The salamanders lost their footing instantly as the floor beneath them burst upward in a wave of steam and molten pressure. Pipes ruptured like snapped bones. Metal fragments screamed through the air. I hit the hatch again. This time it burst open. Cold air rushed in from above, not truly cold, but cold enough that I almost cried from the feeling of it against my scales. I pulled myself through the hatch just as the boiler room erupted beneath me. The blast hurled steam and shrapnel through the opening hard enough to slam me face first across the outer hull of the caravan. For a few seconds I couldn't hear anything except ringing. Then the second explosion hit. The wreck groaned like a dying animal. Metal plates peeled outward below me as white steam burst through every seam in the transport. One side of the caravan sagged into the obsidian roadway with a shriek of twisting iron. I crawled away from the hatch on instinct alone. Rule 7. Never stay on top of something exploding. A chunk of glowing pipe crashed where I had been moments earlier. Good rule. I rolled behind a half-collapsed cargo brace and finally forced myself to breathe properly again. My lungs burned. My gloves were ruined. One sleeve had caught fire somewhere during the climb and was still smoldering faintly. I slapped it out. Around me stretched the ash highway, a black volcanic road cutting through endless red haze beneath the distant glow of furnace towers. Heat shimmered across the horizon in distorted waves. Far overhead, massive chains vanished upward into the smoke clouds where floating foundries drifted through the sky like burning cities. I still wasn't used to seeing those. Didn't matter how many years I lived here, some things stayed impossible. Shouts erupted from below as surviving salamanders scrambled out of the wreck. I immediately flattened against the metal brace.
Find her.
Wonderful. Persistent too. I glanced around quickly. No cover nearby except scattered wreckage fields and cooling slag piles. The nearest market district was at least half an hour away on foot, too far especially with armed salamanders behind me. Then I noticed the maintenance lines running alongside the road, steam pipes, old ones. The small inspection hatch sat half buried in ash nearby. I stared at it for a second, then sighed. I really need better plans. The salamanders were climbing onto the hull now. No timed. I sprinted toward the pipe hatch and dropped to one knee beside the rusted wheel lock. Ancient industrial markings covered the surface in faded Ignan script. Pressure access. Authorized personnel. Only good thing I never planned on becoming authorized personnel. I shoved the screwdriver into the lock housing and twisted hard. The mechanism snapped with satisfying ease. Cheap maintenance. The hatch creaked open, releasing a wave of humid air from below. Not pleasant air. Pipe air. Thick with mineral residue and hot condensation, but survivable, which put it above average for the fire plane. I slipped inside feet first and pulled the hatch closed just as voices reached the roadside above. Darkness swallowed me immediately. For several seconds I just hung there on the ladder listening to muffled footsteps overhead, then silenced. I waited longer anyway. Rule 23. Surviving the first danger usually meant walking into the second one too quickly. Only after a full minute passed did I finally continue downward into the maintenance tunnel below. The pipe corridor stretched endlessly into darkness, lit only by thin orange seams from the heat flowing through the massive conduits beside me. Steam dripped rhythmically from overhead valves. Old system, maybe abandoned, maybe not. I adjusted my satchel carefully and checked the contents by touch. Book still there. Good. I leaned back against the warm metal wall and finally allowed myself a small grin. Nearly cooked alive, almost stabbed, possibly hunted, but I had salvaged books. Worth it. The maintenance tunnel eventually widened enough that I could stand properly again. Barely. The ceiling still forced me to hunch, and every surface sweated. Heat. Massive steam pipes lined both walls like the arteries of some buried iron beast, humming softly as pressure moved through them toward distant foundries. I kept one hand on the warm metal while walking, partly for balance, partly because the vibrations told stories. A failing valve sounded different from a healthy one. A cracked pressure line hissed unevenly. Loose bolts rattled. Restricted flow whined at higher pitch. Most people heard noise. Smiths heard warnings. Rule 6. Always light a torch before opening a sarcophagus. Didn't help much here. Everything was already on fire. I adjusted the cracked goggles on my forehead and continued deeper into the pipe network, counting intersections as I went. Left. Right. Straight. Down ramp. Broken ladder junction. 3 red maintenance marks painted in Ignan. If I got lost down here, nobody would find the body. Not that there would be much body left after the heat. My stomach growled loudly enough to echo through the tunnel. I ignored it. Mostly, food had become easier over the last year, but easier in the city of brass still meant occasionally edible. I'd learned quickly which market stalls watered down stew, which vendors mixed ash fungus into bread, and which districts sold meat that definitely used to speak. Rule 22. Pack extra rations. Unfortunately, extra rations required having rations in the first place. A low mechanical rumble vibrated through the floor beneath my boots. I froze immediately. Not pipes, too rhythmic, heavy movement. I crouched beside a valve housing and extinguished my small lantern crystal with a quick twist. Darkness swallowed the corridor except for thin orange glows from the pipe seams. The rumbling grew louder, then a shape emerged around the far bend. Construct, large one. Its body resembled a 6-legged brass furnace mounted on piston limbs, with smoke venting steadily from exhaust stacks along its spine. Thick chains dragged behind it carrying maintenance tools larger than I was. An Azer repair crawler. I stayed perfectly still. The construct paused midway through the corridor, furnace face glowing faintly as it scanned the tunnel. I held my breath, After several seconds, it continued onward with a thunderous hiss of steam. Only once the sound faded completely did I relax again. Azer maintenance sectors, I whispered. That changed things. Azer tunnels meant nearby workshops. Workshops meant scrap. Meant survival. I smiled despite myself and relit the lantern crystal. The tunnel soon opened into a much larger chamber carved directly into volcanic stone. Thick metal platforms hung over rivers of slow-moving magma below, connected by chains and iron walkways blackened by centuries of soot. Ancient equipment filled the cavern. Broken cranes, collapsed smelters, abandoned ore carts, most importantly, discard piles. Actual mountains of industrial scrap lined one wall beneath. Hanging chains. I think normal people saw junk. I saw possibility. Bent copper tubing, pressure gauges, gear assemblies, rusted tool heads. Half-melted brass plates. My exhaustion vanished instantly. I scrambled toward the nearest pile and started digging with both hands. A mostly intact valve regulator, useful. Point 3 unbroken bolts, very useful. Copper wiring, excellent. They cracked, but reparable. Pressure seal. Beautiful. Hours disappeared. That happened a lot when I worked. The outside world slowly stopped existing while my brain sorted materials into categories: future projects, repair values, alloy quality, heat resistance, possible enchantment compatibility. Then my claw brushed against leather. I paused, carefully pulling debris aside, revealed a half-buried satchel blackened by soot but mostly intact. Not industrial issue. Traveler's bag. I opened it slowly. Inside were books, real books, not manuals. Not shipping records. Books. My pulse quickened immediately. Most pages were damaged from heat exposure, edges curled and brittle, but several remained readable beneath layers of soot. One title immediately caught my eye: Foundations of Enchantment Theory, Apprentice Edition. I stared at it for several seconds, then grinned so hard my jaw hurt. Worth getting stabbed for, possibly worth getting exploded for too. I left the scrap chamber only when the magma flow dimmed enough to mimic evening. Not that the elemental plane of fire really had nights. The sky merely changed shades. Bright furnace orange became deep volcanic red, while distant firestorms painted the horizon in flashes of white heat. The great smoke clouds above the city of brass reflected the glow like burning thunderheads. Beautiful. And the same way a sword was beautiful. I kept to the lower maintenance routes as I traveled home, moving through forgotten steam corridors and service trenches beneath the main trade roads. Safer that way, mostly. The book stayed wrapped tightly inside my satchel beneath spare cloth and scavenged brass sheets to protect them from heat and moisture. Every few minutes I checked they were still there. I trusted Efreet merchants more than unsecured bags, which was to say, not at all. Eventually the industrial tunnels gave way to the outer salvage districts, endless fields of abandoned machinery half buried in black ash dunes. Broken constructs leaned against collapsed foundries like giant skeletons frozen mid-death. That was where I lived, not because I liked it, because nobody else did. My shelter hid beneath the ribcage of an overturned ore hauler larger than a house. From outside it looked like another ruined transport slowly sinking into volcanic dust. Inside was different, not comfortable, but mined. I slipped through the concealed side hatch and locked it behind me with 3 separate mechanisms. Rule 20. Kobolds never set just one trap. The interior smelled faintly of oil, hot metal, paper, and sulfur smoke. Home. The main room barely stood taller than me. Salvaged brass panels lined the walls alongside shelves made from cargo crate planks and cut furnace grating. Pipes ran through the ceiling carrying diverted steam from nearby industrial lines. Heating a crude exchanger system I'd built from cracked boiler parts. Took me 3 explosions to get the pressure right. Point 4 if counting the ceiling. My sleeping area sat beneath a patched heat-resistant tent stretched over insulated framework scavenged from an Azer caravan. Most of the original enchantments were dead, but enough remained to keep the interior merely unbearable instead of lethal. Progressed. I carefully removed the books from my satchel and placed them on the work table one by one. My entire mood improved instantly. There were 7 total. Point 3 completely ruined. Point 2 partially readable. Point 1 written entirely in a dialect of Ignan technical shorthand I barely understood, and the enchantment book. I picked it up gently. The leather binding crackled from heat damage, and several pages had fused together along the edges. but the core text survived. That alone made today the most successful salvage run in months. I cleaned my goggles with the edge of my sleeve before opening the first page carefully beside the lantern crystal. The handwriting inside wasn't printed. Notes, margin annotations covered almost every page. Corrections, equations, arguments with the original author. My pulse quickened immediately. Someone had studied this book seriously. I read while eating dinner. Dinner was terrible. A strip of smoked ash lizard, half a stale fungus cake, and mineral-heavy water collected from pipe condensation. I barely noticed the taste. The book mattered more. Basic enchanting theory, resonance ratios, material conductivity, runic stability, heat dissipation through mana thread lattices. I stopped suddenly halfway down one page, then reread the paragraph slower again and again. My eyes widened. A properly constructed enchantment is not magic forced upon an object. It is an agreement between function, material, and intent. Agreement, not forced. I stared at the diagrams beneath the passage. The author described magical objects almost like living conversations. Every material had preferences. Every structure guided mana differently. Bad enchantments failed because the item resisted what the enchanter demanded of it. Not enough listening, too much commanding. I slowly looked around my tiny workshop. The sorted bolts, the pressure valves, the cracked brass plates, the salvaged tools. Machines made sense to me, always had, maybe because unlike people, machines followed rules. Rules could be learned, improved, survived. I turned another page carefully. Then another. At some point my eyes grew heavy. The lantern crystal dimmed lower while distant foundry thunder echoed through the ash fields outside. I curled beneath the patched tent with the book still resting against my chest. For the first time in a long while, the heat didn't feel unbearable, because for the first time since hatching in this burning plain, the future felt possible.